In the thin, cold air of a forgotten Afghan valley, 20 Navy SEALs were trapped in a kill zone, their radios screaming with static. All exits were sealed by enemy fire, and hope was a dwindling resource. Their rescue would not come from a gunship or a quick reaction force. It would come from a single bullet, fired by a woman they had never met, from a ridge they believed was impossible to reach. This is the story of the shot that defied orders, shattered expectations, and saved 24 lives. The early morning sun was a pale, cold coin in the Afghan sky, casting long shadows that seemed to cling to the jagged teeth of the Hindu Kush. Operation Red Veil had begun as a textbook night raid, a swift and silent visit to a high-value target compound nestled in the formidable Gorban Valley. 20 operators from SEAL Team 10, Ghosts in the Darkness, had flowed over the mud brick walls like black water. Intel was solid. The mission was clean. But in those mountains, solid intelligence had a way of turning to dust by first light. They had their man, a facilitator moving weapons for a lethal insurgent network, secured and zip-tied before he could rub the sleep from his eyes. The exfiltration point was a narrow goat trail leading to a landing zone 2 clicks east, where the low thump of awaiting Chinooks was already a promise in the distance. Then the valley awoke. A single, misplaced step by a point man triggered an IED that was never on any schematic. The explosion was not just a blast of heat and shrapnel. It was a signal flare to the entire valley. From hidden spider holes in the hillsides and from behind the thick, ancient walls of surrounding villages, muzzle flashes erupted. The gunfire was not the ragged pops of an ambush. It was a disciplined, cross-ridden storm of lead that poured down from 3 elevated sides. The SEALs, caught in the low ground of a natural bowl, were instantly pinned. Their commander, a seasoned lieutenant called Rhino, knew within seconds they were in a perfect kill zone. The radio crackled to life. All stations, Whiskey Delta is contact, heavy volume, complex ambush. Request immediate air support and QRF. The response from command was laced with static and grim reality. Weather had closed in over the mountains to the south. The Apaches were grounded. The quick reaction force was a 90-minute flight away, and the insurgents were already moving to cut off the only remaining exit route, a steep, rocky defile to the north. Back at Bagram Airfield, the Joint Operations Center was a hive of controlled tension. Screens glowed with telemetry and live drone feed. The image was clear and horrifying. 20 heat signatures clumped behind whatever meager cover they could find, slowly being constricted by dozens of other, moving signatures. The officers watched, faces grim. A Predator drone orbited high above, its Hellfire missiles useless without a clear angle that wouldn't risk the team. The discussion turned to mitigation, to contingency, to the terrible calculus of modern warfare. Evacuation was deemed impossible without catastrophic loss. A senior officer, his voice heavy, voiced the unthinkable consensus forming in the room. We may have to stand by and prepare for an extraction of remains. But in a dimly lit corner of the TOC, away from the main huddle, a woman watched the same screen. Her name was Chief Petty Officer Lena Vance, a Naval Special Warfare Development Group sniper attached to an agency element for a different mission entirely. She was there as an observer, a liaison. On her tablet was the feed from a different asset, a smaller, stealthier drone she'd been authorized to use for her own reconnaissance. Its flight path showed something the Predator's wider orbit had missed. A narrow, crumbling spine of rock, barely more than a goat path, snaked up the western ridge, directly above and behind the main insurgent firing position, a heavy machine gun nest that had the SEALs' final escape route locked in a deadly embrace. Vance was not part of the SEALs' chain of command. She was an outsider. She studied the topography, her mind calculating wind, altitude, angle, and the brutal physics of a shot that would be at the very extreme edge of possibility. She approached the Air Force controller managing the Predator. "Sir, there's a possible firing position here," she said, her voice calm, pointing to her tablet. The controller, a captain, looked from her screen to the main feed, shaking his head. That's a 70-degree slope, Chief. No one can get up there, and even if they could, that's a 1,900-meter shot at a downward stream. It's a fantasy. Vance held his gaze. I can get there, and I can make the shot. The room fell silent. All eyes turned to her, a mix of skepticism and desperate hope. The mission commander, a graying colonel, walked over. You understand what you're asking? That's an unsupported, unauthorized penetration into active hostile territory. If you're compromised, we cannot get to you. Vance nodded once. I understand, sir, but they have no other doors out of that room. The weight of the M2010 enhanced sniper rifle on her back was a familiar anchor, but the climb was a descent into a special kind of hell. Vance moved alone, a single shadow against the fractured shale and scree of the western ridge. She had declined a spotter. This was a one-woman equation now. Every dislodged stone sounded like a thunderclap in her ears. The air grew thinner, scraping at her lungs. Her world narrowed to the next handhold, the next foothold, the burning in her thighs. She could hear, faintly, the distorted echo of the battle below, the relentless chatter of the PKM machine gun, the sharper reports of M4S returning fire in controlled, ammo-conserving bursts. In her earpiece, she listened to the SEAL net, their communications growing tighter, more urgent. Alpha's hit. Leg wound. Ammo at 40%. Rhino's voice, steady but strained, hold discipline. We wait for the break. Vance reached a small, semi-sheltered ledge after an hour of grueling ascent. It was not ideal, but it was the only platform that offered both a line of sight and a shred of stability. She was 1,912 meters from the machine gun nest, a distance where a bullet could take nearly 3 seconds to arrive. The wind was a capricious demon, whipping and eddying through the valley below. The angle was so steep she had to position her body almost sideways, the rifle's bipod legs uneven on the rock. She unfolded the rifle, the smooth, cold metal a comfort. She dialed the elevation into the scope, a series of precise clicks that accounted for the brutal drop of the .300 Winchester Magnum round over such a distance. She calculated the Coriolis effect, the spin of the earth itself pulling at her bullet. The crosshairs in her scope danced and swam over the distant target. The gunner, a blurry figure behind the weapon, was reloading. A second man, a spotter with binoculars, sat beside him. Down in the valley, time was bleeding out. The SEALs had pulled their wounded into the center of their shrinking perimeter. The dust and cordite hung in the air. Rhino checked his watch. The QRF was still 40 minutes out. He knew they didn't have 10. He made the call. All elements, prepare to break north on my mark. It's going to be a sprint. Cover what you can. It was a suicide order, and every man knew it. The machine gun would cut them in half before they made 10 yards. They tightened their grips, shared a last look and nod. They would go out together, fighting. On the ledge, Lena Vance exhaled slowly, her finger resting alongside the trigger guard. The world fell away, the cold, the ache in her muscles, the dizzying height. There was only the breath, the whisper of the wind, the steady beat of her own heart. She found a tiny, still point between breaths. The crosshairs settled, not on the gunner but on the spotter. He was the brain, the gunner was the finger. Take the brain, confuse the finger. She inhaled, let half of it out, and between one heartbeat and the next, her finger took up the slack. The crack of the rifle was a sharp, isolated bark, swallowed instantly by the vastness of the mountains. For nearly 3 seconds, nothing happened. Then, through her scope, she saw the spotter's head snap back in a mist of red. Chaos erupted in the nest. The gunner stopped firing, turning to his fallen comrade, confused and exposed. Vance worked the bolt, the spent casing flicking away into the void. She breathed, recentered. The second shot was easier, a fraction of a second faster. It struck the PKM's receiver, a catastrophic hit that shattered the weapon's mechanism and sent shrapnel into the gunner. The sudden, deafening silence from the primary enemy position was more startling than the noise had been. In the valley, Rhino froze, his go command dying on his lips. The lethal stream of fire that had held them in place for over an hour had simply stopped. "What the hell?" a SEAL muttered over the net. Then a new voice, calm and clear, cut through the frequency. "Whiskey Delta, this is Guardian. Heavy gun nest is neutralized. You have a window. Advise immediate movement north." The SEALs didn't question it. They moved as one organism, surging forward, dragging their wounded, laying down suppressive fire on the remaining enemy positions, which were now disorganized and confused by the sudden loss of their key weapon. Vance didn't wait to watch. Her mission was only half done. She became the hunter. For the next 20 minutes, she selectively and methodically engaged the remaining insurgent leaders she could identify. Men with radios, men pointing and shouting. Each shot was a message. You're not safe. You were seen. The psychological effect was devastating. The coordinated pressure on the SEALs collapsed into sporadic, unaimed fire. The two Chinooks, having gotten the green light, thundered into the valley, their miniguns hosing down the hillsides as they flared for landing. The SEALs piled in, helping their wounded aboard. Rhino was the last to climb in, turning to scan the impossible western ridge. He saw nothing but rock and shadow. As the helicopter clawed for altitude, he keyed his mic. "Guardian, this is Whiskey Delta Actual. We are wheels up. That was the best shooting I've ever heard of. We owe you one." There was a pause, then the reply, faint but clear. "Just another day at the office. Get home safe." A formal debrief at Bagram was a sterile affair. The official report would call it a multi-layered support operation, crediting timely air support and the SEAL's own resilience. Vance's name was in a classified annex, a footnote for those with sufficient clearance. There was no medal ceremony, no public recognition. That wasn't the world she operated in. A few days later, as she was packing her gear for another assignment, a plain, unmarked package was left at her bunk. Inside was a patch, the SEAL Team 10 Trident. With it was a folded note. It read simply, "From the men in the valley. Our door was opened because of you, Rhino and the others." She allowed herself a small, private smile, folded the note, and placed the patch inside her helmet bag. Weeks later, back in the States, the SEALs of that mission were on mandatory leave, trying to readjust to a world of soft beds and quiet nights. They gathered at a quiet bar in Virginia Beach, a reunion of shared trauma and unspoken bond. The conversation, as it always did, turned to the valley. They spoke of the heat, the dust, the sound of the rounds pinging off the rocks. And they spoke of the shot, or shots. They debated the distance, the wind. They wondered who or what Guardian was. Rumors had trickled down: a Delta sniper, a CIA paramilitary, a ghost. Rhino listened, swirling his drink. He had heard more than the others, through back channels. He cleared his throat, and the table fell quiet. "I made some calls," he said, his voice low, "to a buddy at DevGru. He couldn't say much. He just told me to stop looking for a who. He said, the person who pulled you out of the fire that day, she's the reason we have to rethink everything we thought we knew." The men around the table fell silent, the implication settling over them. The respect in their eyes was no longer just for a miraculous shot, but for the sheer, defiant will it represented. The shot had saved their lives, but the story of who had made it slowly, quietly, began to change something more profound. The unspoken architecture of what was possible and who was allowed to be possible in the world they lived in. The legend of Guardian became a quiet, kept secret among them, a testament not just to precision, but to a courage that ventured alone into the impossible, and with steady hands, carved out a door where none had existed. This response is AI-generated, for reference only.